What would you say to someone who hears what you just said and they learn, okay, this is what orthodoxy means? They hear you refer to the creeds and they say, yeah, but we have progressed a lot farther now in history and in the church and our culture. You know, we're more enlightened, not just scientifically and technologically, but also enlightened in terms of what are acceptable lifestyles and understanding that we see a broader and more diverse range of lifestyles available today than what they had, and the kind of things that they may have suppressed. And so it's narrow, it is regressive to say that we have to live by what these older ancient people thought was the only right way to live. And they say, so haven't we moved on from that? Why can't we move on from that? So what would be, in other words, your apologetic for orthodoxy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think a lot of people are asking that question, and it really comes back to the question of like what's essential and what's not to orthodoxy. Because I mean, it is true there are certain things that the church got really worked up about at certain times in certain places that we would look at and say, yeah, some of the practices, some that's probably not as not really healthy, or that there have been extremes here and there. When you think about Christian views of the body from time to time, or there's been ascetic extremes and things like that. So I think it's a good question to ask. The challenge for us today, though, is recognizing that there is such a thing as what I would call a moral orthodoxy. And when I speak to that, I'm talking about particular ethical positions that are so tightly connected to foundational truths that are in the creeds, clearly taught in the scriptures, that to move away from them is actually to do damage to the superstructure of Christianity itself. And so, for example, there are people today that say, well, there's nothing said about marriage in the creeds. So you can be completely orthodox and affirm the creeds and yet believe we should expand our understanding of marriage to include people of the same sex, or to, either multiple partners and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so you've got that kind of argument there. And on the surface, it sounds, it's kind of taking what I would call a minimalist approach to the creeds. It's as if to say, hey, I can affirm these bare doctrines of the faith, at least the minimal. This is what constitutes orthodoxy, but then I can have wild innovations over here, or things that the rest of the church wouldn't recognize, and still be in the orthodox side. I don't think that that's how the Christians through the ages have looked at the creeds. When Augustine had his famous altercations with Pelagius over, really a question of the nature of humanity and whether or not we're born innocent, naturally good, or naturally evil, mm-hmm. And really how salvation is played out, and whether we what we do, how we live a moral life and whatnot. When Augustine had those debates, he didn't say, well, there's nothing in the creeds about Pelagianism, so I guess we can just agree to disagree on this. He recognized that the implications of those creeds covered this particular issue, and that's one of the reasons why the church agreed with Augustine and why Pelagius was seen as heretical. I think something similar is happening with conversations about marriage and sexuality and things like that, and that it's not that we're raising the level of sexuality to the creedal standpoint. It's that we're recognizing the anthropological, the doctrine of humanity that's underpinning the move toward same-sex marriage or whatnot is actually that in itself is what's heretical. It's not the question what is marriage. It's the question of what is a human. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be a human body? Like, what does it mean to be for our bodies to have natural ends, goals? It really goes back to that first line of the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. The implications of that line cover what we're talking about here, what it means to be created male and female and whatnot. So I think that the way that you can tell that this is a fundamental aspect of orthodoxy is that marriage it's like a load-bearing wall in the house of faith, in that you move that that wall and the structure collapses. And virtually everybody that you see, every theologian, every, Christian teacher, preacher, whoever, that shifts on the issue of sexuality and marriage, within a decade or so, it becomes clear they've also shifted on all sorts of other doctrines.
Yeah.
Because so many things hinge on that anthropological turn that happens at that moment. And so yeah, I think it's actually short-sighted and somewhat narrow-minded, actually, to think that you can just tweak something like marriage and keep the rest of orthodoxy all there together. It's really, it's not that simple. I think it's actually, once you understand the expansiveness of orthodoxy, you see it in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know this is a point that you make in the book, but I think what people don't understand, if they make some sort of the objection like I had made and want to try to rearrange the house like you were talking about, is missing that you're not just stepping out from the old dusty tradition into like a new progressive freedom, but you're exchanging one orthodoxy for another. You're exchanging this orthodoxy, which we would argue is based upon the revealed word of God, so in line with who God is and his will and his character, for an orthodoxy written by someone else. And based upon man's wisdom. And so it's not just, it's not just like a stepping out into this like newfound freedom or necessarily something better, but it's a substitute orthodoxy that you might now be following.
Well, and that's really, and honestly, I think you're right about that. And that's one of the reasons why people who generally go in that direction, over time, sort of write off everybody who's not going with them in that direction, because it is a foundational plank of the new religion they've constructed on top of this. And that's really how all heresies begin. Heresies have a kernel of truth generally all the time. It's actually one of the things I show in the book is that most of the time a heresy begins with one truth that is isolated and taken out of the entire Christian tradition. And that one truth, once it gets isolated and divorced from other very essential Christian truths, it then becomes a weapon that is used to sort of clobber the other truths within Christianity. So it becomes weaponized. And when that happens, it's become the unassailable plank of a new foundation, a new religion that's sort of constructed on top of that. So yeah, that's one of the challenges that we face, is being able to recognize that. And the only way to really recognize that, though, is by being in communication with the church around the world, that you're not, so tunnel focused on sort of your own culture, your own society, but recognizing that there's a global church here. And the global consensus really matters, and the church throughout history. I mean, the way I put it is, if your position, if you take an ethical position or a doctrinal position, if your position is one that would horrify basically every theologian, pastor, and lay teacher in the past 2,000 years, the burden of proof is on you to explain why that deviation from the norm is actually acceptable, or not just acceptable, but, inevitable, the way we should go. That's where the burden of proof is. And so in this particular case, for us in sort of in Western Europe or in North America or whatnot, questions about anthropology and sexuality or whatnot are at the height there. And we really do need the global church and the church throughout history to help us maintain our bearings, to be able to see why it is that this is not the direction the church should, or ultimately the church will go.